My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened when I was 28 years old. Back then, I worked as a wildlife photographer across the Appalachian Mountains. Most of my assignments involved tracking black bears, documenting elk migration, or photographing abandoned mining towns for outdoor magazines. I loved isolation. I loved the silence of the woods. At least, I used to. In October of 2021, I traveled to a forgotten stretch of forest in eastern Kentucky after hearing rumors about a valley locals called Whistling Hollow. Hunters claimed strange whistles echoed through the woods at night, almost like people communicating with each other from miles apart. Some said it was moonshiners. Others believed it was wild mountain people living far beyond civilization. I laughed it off at first. The last person I spoke to before entering the forest was an old gas station owner named Earl. When he noticed my camera equipment, his smile disappeared instantly. "You hear whistles after dark," he muttered. "You do not whistle back." At the time, I thought he was just another superstitious old man trying to scare tourists. I wish I had listened. The trail into Whistling Hollow was barely visible beneath layers of dead leaves. Massive trees blocked most of the sunlight, turning the forest dark long before sunset. I hiked nearly 6 miles, carrying camera gear, camping supplies, and enough food for 4 days. By evening, I found the remains of an abandoned fire tower near a shallow creek. It seemed like the perfect place to camp. The tower had collapsed decades earlier, leaving behind rusted beams and scattered wooden planks. Around the site, strange symbols had been carved into nearby trees. At first, I assumed they were trail markers, but the deeper I looked, the stranger they became. Some resembled human stick figures, hanging upside down. Others looked like circles filled with scratches. One tree had hundreds of tiny lines carved into the bark like tally marks. That feeling of being watched started shortly after sunset. I kept hearing movement somewhere beyond the trees. Slow footsteps, branches snapping, too heavy for deer, too controlled for bears. Then, around midnight, I heard the first whistle. It came from far away, a long, uneven note drifting through the darkness. Seconds later, another whistle answered from somewhere behind me. I barely slept that night. Every hour or so, another whistle echoed through the mountains. Sometimes it sounded distant, other times terrifyingly close. What bothered me most was the pattern. One whistle would rise from somewhere downhill, followed by another farther north, then another somewhere behind my camp. It sounded coordinated, almost like people signaling to each other. Around 3 in the morning, I finally grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire. The forest was dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Then I noticed footprints near the creek beside my campsite. Bare human footprints. The mud preserved them perfectly. Long toes, deep impressions. Whoever made them had been standing there recently, watching my tent from across the water. I followed the tracks with my flashlight until they disappeared into thick brush. That was when I heard breathing nearby. Heavy, wet breathing. I froze instantly. Something moved behind a cluster of trees about 30 feet away. I only caught a glimpse of it for a second. Pale skin, extremely thin arms, long black hair hanging over its face. Then it vanished into the darkness. The whistles stopped immediately after that, as if whatever was out there already knew I had seen it. The next morning, I convinced myself exhaustion had distorted what I saw. Appalachia was full of strange people living off-grid. Maybe I had stumbled near a hidden camp. Maybe some local hermit had been spying on me. Still, I packed my pistol onto my belt before continuing deeper into Whistling Hollow. Around noon, I discovered an abandoned mining entrance carved into the side of the mountain. Rotten wooden beams framed the opening, and rusted tracks disappeared into complete darkness underground. Nearby, I found signs someone had been living there recently. Old animal bones littered the ground. There were empty food cans stacked neatly beside the rocks. Torn blankets hung from tree branches like makeshift curtains. I even found a child's shoe sitting near the mine entrance, half covered in mud. That was the first moment real fear settled into my stomach, because none of it looked old. Someone was still here. As I photographed the area, I suddenly heard movement inside the mine tunnel. At first, it sounded like rocks shifting deeper underground. Then came whispering, multiple voices, soft, rapid, impossible to understand. I slowly raised my camera toward the darkness when a small rock suddenly flew out from inside the tunnel and struck my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble backward. Then another whistle echoed directly above me from the ridge overhead. This one sounded close enough to touch. I should have left right then. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hike back to my truck and forget Whistling Hollow ever existed. But curiosity can be a dangerous thing, especially when you spend years chasing stories in isolated places. A part of me still believed there had to be a logical explanation. I climbed the ridge where the whistle had come from. The terrain became steeper the higher I went. Loose rocks slid beneath my boots, and dead trees leaned over the mountainside like skeletons. About halfway up, I found something hanging from a branch above the trail. At first, I thought it was animal hide. Then I realized it was clothing. Several pieces of old clothing had been tied together with rope and suspended from the trees like warning signs. Children's shirts, torn jackets, dirty jeans stiffened by age, and rainwater. Beneath them sat dozens of animal skulls arranged in a perfect circle. I immediately started taking photographs, convinced I had stumbled onto some kind of hidden cult site. But as I crouched near the skulls, I noticed fresh footprints surrounding the area. Dozens of them, bare feet, different sizes, adults, and children. That was when another whistle echoed through the trees nearby. This time it was answered by several more all around me. The whistles grew louder as I hurried back downhill. They no longer sounded random. There was rhythm to them now. Sharp bursts followed by longer tones, almost like coded signals. Every few seconds, another whistle answered from a different direction, and for the first time I realized they were surrounding me. I kept glancing over my shoulder while moving through the trees. That was when I saw one clearly. A man, or something that used to be a man, stood between two trees about 50 yards away. He was painfully thin, with filthy gray skin stretched tight across his bones. His beard hung nearly to his chest, tangled with leaves and dirt. But the worst part was his eyes. They looked completely black in the shadows. He didn't move. He simply stared at me while slowly raising one finger to his lips, as if warning me to stay quiet. I reached for my pistol, but before I could pull it free, another figure appeared farther behind him. Then another. Women, children. At least 6 people stood silently among the trees watching me. None of them blinked. None of them spoke. Then, somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard an awful sound that made my blood run cold. A human scream, cut off suddenly in the darkness, and every single figure turned their heads toward the sound at the exact same time. I ran. The moment that scream echoed through the forest, survival instinct finally overpowered curiosity. I turned and sprinted downhill through the trees, branches whipping across my face while loose rocks slid beneath my boots. Behind me, the whistles exploded into chaos. Short bursts, rapid calls, dozens of them. It sounded like an entire tribe communicating through the mountains. I kept expecting footsteps behind me, but instead, there was only silence between the whistles. That somehow made it worse. It felt organized, controlled, like they knew exactly where I was going before I did. As dusk settled over the forest, I spotted my campsite near the collapsed fire tower. Relief hit me for half a second, until I realized someone had been inside my tent. My backpack had been torn open. Food was scattered everywhere, but none of my expensive camera gear had been touched. Instead, they'd taken small personal things. My wallet, my watch, a framed picture of my younger sister I kept inside my bag. That terrified me more than theft ever could, because it meant they had searched through my belongings carefully, like they were trying to learn who I was. Then I noticed fresh footprints circling the campsite. At least 20 people had surrounded my tent while I was gone. Night came fast in Whistling Hollow. I shoved supplies into my bag while trying to control my breathing. My truck was still nearly 6 miles away, and the trail back crossed steep terrain that would be dangerous in complete darkness. But staying there felt even worse. As I prepared to leave, I heard movement near the creek. Not hiding this time, walking openly. Slow footsteps approached from beyond the trees, while low whistles echoed farther uphill. I killed my flashlight instantly and crouched behind the ruined fire tower. A group emerged from the darkness moments later. There were 5 of them, 2 men, 2 women, 1 child. The child looked no older than 8. Their clothes were filthy and mismatched, hanging loosely from their bodies like scraps stolen from garbage piles. The adults carried long hunting knives and crude spears made from sharpened branches. One of the women dragged a dead raccoon behind her by its tail. But what disturbed me most was how they behaved. They never spoke, not once. Instead, they communicated entirely through whistles and strange clicking noises from the backs of their throats. The child suddenly stopped near my tent and slowly lifted its head toward my hiding place. For a horrifying second, I thought it saw me. Then the kid smiled. Not a normal smile. It stretched far too wide across its face, revealing teeth sharpened into points. I stayed perfectly still behind the ruined tower while the group searched through my campsite. The adults moved with terrifying calmness, almost animal-like, sniffing clothing and touching objects with dirty fingers. Every few seconds, one of them would whistle softly, and distant whistles answered somewhere deeper in the forest. They were communicating with others nearby, maybe dozens of them. The child eventually wandered away from the tent and walked directly toward the tower where I was hiding. My hand tightened around the pistol while my heartbeat pounded so loudly I thought they would hear it. The kid stopped only a few feet away. Its face looked horribly wrong up close. Dirt covered most of its skin, but beneath the grime I could see scars running across its cheeks and forehead. The child tilted its head slowly, listening to my breathing through the darkness. Then another whistle suddenly echoed from uphill. The child instantly looked toward the sound. A moment later, every member of the group froze. I heard footsteps approaching through the forest. Heavy footsteps, not theirs. The feral people backed away nervously, almost frightened. One of the women grabbed the child and pulled it toward the trees while emitting rapid clicking sounds. Then I saw something massive moving between the woods uphill, something taller than the others, and even they seemed afraid of it. The massive figure emerged just enough for moonlight to strike its body. At first, I thought it was a bear standing upright, but it moved too naturally on 2 legs. Its body was enormous, covered in filthy layers of animal pelts and torn clothing stitched together crudely with rope. Antlers had been tied onto its head like some twisted crown. In one hand, it carried a long wooden staff decorated with bones and strips of hanging flesh. The whistles stopped completely. The entire forest became silent. The giant figure slowly turned toward my hiding spot. I could not see its face clearly beneath the tangled hair and animal hides, but I felt it staring directly at me. Then it lifted the staff and struck it once against the ground. Immediately, whistles erupted across the mountains, hundreds of them. The feral people scattered through the woods like hunting dogs unleashed from chains. That finally broke me. I bolted from behind the tower and sprinted blindly through the darkness, while screams and whistles echoed everywhere around me. Branches tore at my clothes as I crashed downhill for what felt like hours. I reached my truck just before dawn, and when I finally looked back toward the tree line, I saw them standing there, dozens of pale figures watching silently from the forest edge. None of them chased me. They simply stood there, smiling. When I returned home, I discovered something inside my camera bag that I know for a fact was never there before. A tiny carved wooden whistle, and sometimes, very late at night, I still hear answering whistles outside my apartment window, even though I now live hundreds of miles away from Appalachia. My name is Rebecca Nolan, and this happened during the winter of 2018 when I worked as a social worker in rural West Virginia. Most of my cases involved poverty, neglected homes, and children living in isolated mountain communities. It was exhausting work, but I genuinely cared about helping people. In December, I received a strange report from the sheriff's department involving a missing family near Black Pine Mountain. According to local records, a woman named Clara Vance and her 2 sons had vanished from their cabin nearly 8 months earlier. The case had gone cold after search teams failed to locate any evidence. But then, the neighbors started reporting lights in the cabin again. At night, they claimed they could hear movement inside the house despite the place supposedly being abandoned. One elderly neighbor even swore she saw children standing at the upstairs windows watching the woods. The sheriff believed squatters had moved into the property and wanted someone from social services present in case children were involved. I agreed to go with Deputy Harold Weaver the following morning. The moment I mentioned Black Pine Mountain to locals at the diner, the entire room went quiet. One old woman stared at me and whispered, "If you hear scratching under the floorboards, leave immediately." The drive to the Vance property took nearly 2 hours through winding mountain roads covered in ice. Snow blanketed the forest so heavily that many of the trees bent under its weight. Deputy Weaver barely spoke during the trip. He kept chewing tobacco nervously while glancing toward the woods. Eventually, we reached a narrow dirt path leading deeper into the mountains. The Vance cabin sat alone beside a frozen creek surrounded by towering black pines. Even during daylight, the place looked wrong. The windows were boarded unevenly, and the roof sagged badly beneath the snow. Smoke drifted slowly from the chimney, despite the house officially having no electricity or running water. Someone was definitely inside. Weaver knocked hard on the front door while resting his other hand near his revolver. At first, nothing happened. Then I heard movement somewhere inside the cabin, not footsteps. Crawling, slow scraping sounds moving beneath the floorboards. We exchanged nervous looks before the front door creaked open a few inches. A filthy young boy peeked out through the gap. He looked around 10 years old, painfully thin, with tangled hair hanging over his face. The child stared at us silently for several seconds. Then he whispered something that still gives me chills. She said not to let the underground people see you. Deputy Weaver immediately pushed the door open wider and asked the boy where his mother was. The child didn't answer at first. He just kept staring past us toward the tree line behind the cabin, like he expected something to emerge from the forest at any second. The inside of the house smelled awful, rotting food, damp wood, and something earthy, almost like a wet cave. Every window had been covered with blankets and nailed boards, making the cabin unnaturally dark. Old cans and dirty dishes littered the kitchen. Near the fireplace, I noticed several animal carcasses hanging from hooks along the wall. Rabbits, squirrels. One looked disturbingly close to a dog. Then I saw the scratches. Hundreds of deep claw-like marks covered the wooden floor near the hallway. They looked recent. The boy finally spoke again, while gripping the doorway tightly. "Mom says they come up when the mountain gets hungry." Deputy Weaver asked him who they were, but before the child could answer, a loud bang echoed beneath the floorboards directly under our feet. I jumped instantly. Another bang followed, then another. Something was moving underneath the cabin. Not rats, not small animals. Whatever was down there sounded human-sized. Deputy Weaver drew his revolver immediately. The banging beneath the floor suddenly stopped, replaced by slow scratching sounds traveling underneath the cabin from one room to another. It sounded like someone crawling through dirt directly below us. Then we heard a woman screaming upstairs. Weaver rushed toward the staircase while I grabbed the boy and pulled him behind me. The second-floor hallway was freezing cold compared to the rest of the cabin. Several doors stood partially open, revealing filthy bedrooms covered in blankets, candles, and strange piles of bones arranged carefully in corners. The screaming continued from the final room upstairs. When Weaver kicked the door open, we found a woman crouched beside the bed holding a hunting knife. Her clothes were filthy, and torn, and her face looked gaunt from months of starvation. At first, I assumed she was Clara Vance. Then I realized something horrifying. The woman looked at least 70 years old. Clara Vance was supposed to be 32. The old woman hissed at us like an animal and pointed the knife toward the floorboards. "You should not have come here," she whispered. "They hear everything beneath the mountain." Suddenly, the entire cabin shook violently, and somewhere below us, dozens of voices began whistling together in the darkness. The whistling beneath the cabin grew louder with every passing second. It did not sound random or animal-like. The whistles rose and fell in strange patterns, almost musical in a horrifying way. Some sounded high-pitched like children. Others were deep and uneven. Together they echoed through the floorboards like an underground language. Deputy Weaver grabbed the old woman and demanded answers. Instead of fighting him, she started laughing. Not normal laughter either. It sounded weak and broken, like someone who had completely lost their mind after years of terror. "You stayed too long," she whispered. "Now they know your smell." The child beside me suddenly panicked. He grabbed my arm so hard his nails dug into my skin. "We have to hide before dark," he said quickly. "They don't like strangers upstairs after dark." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. Upstairs, meaning whatever lived below the cabin came up at night. Suddenly, a loud crash exploded downstairs. The front door had slammed open by itself. Freezing wind rushed through the house, extinguishing several candles at once. Deputy Weaver aimed his flashlight down the hallway while I heard slow footsteps entering the cabin below us. Not one pair, several. Heavy, dragging footsteps. And then came the smell. Wet dirt mixed with rotting meat. Deputy Weaver ordered everyone to stay upstairs while he checked the first floor. I begged him not to go alone, but he ignored me and slowly descended the staircase with his revolver raised. The old woman began rocking back and forth near the bed. "They came early," she muttered repeatedly. "The mountain must be starving." I stayed with the boy while listening to Weaver's footsteps creak below us. For nearly 30 seconds, there was complete silence downstairs. Then he shouted, "Rebecca, get out of the house now!" A gunshot exploded beneath us, then another, then screaming. I grabbed the boy's hand and rushed toward the stairs just in time to see Deputy Weaver stumbling backward across the living room floor. Blood poured from a deep wound on his shoulder while he fired wildly into the darkness near the kitchen. That was when I saw them. 3 pale figures crawled out from a broken section of the floorboards near the fireplace. They moved on all fours at first, thin and filthy, like starving animals. Their arms looked unnaturally long, and their skin was gray beneath layers of mud. One slowly stood upright. Its mouth stretched into a horrifying grin filled with filed-down teeth. Then it whistled directly at us, and more whistles answered from underneath the cabin. Everything collapsed into chaos after that. Deputy Weaver kept firing into the crawling figures while shouting at us to run, but the cabin was already being surrounded from every direction. The whistles were no longer distant or underground anymore. They were inside the house, echoing through the walls like something living within the structure itself. The boy pulled me toward the back hallway, screaming that there was an exit through the storage room. I dragged him, while the old woman suddenly ran past us in the opposite direction, laughing again as if she had accepted whatever was happening. We reached the storage room and found a narrow trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. The moment I opened it, I understood why the cabin smelled like earth. There was a tunnel, a narrow dirt passage dug directly beneath the house, reinforced with broken wood and rusted metal scraps. Cold air rose from it like breath from a living creature. Weaver shouted again from the living room, but his voice was weaker now. Something had reached him. I hesitated for only a second. Then another whistle came from right behind us, inside the walls. That was enough. I pulled the boy into the tunnel. The tunnel was worse than the cabin. It felt alive. The walls were damp and soft, like they had been carved out by something that never stopped digging. Every few feet, We saw scratch marks and human handprints embedded in the dirt, as if people had been dragged through here for years. The boy refused to let go of my hand. He kept whispering that the underground people were guides of the mountain, and that they bring new families below when the old ones forget their place. I didn't understand what he meant at first, until we heard movement behind us. Slow, crawling sounds echoed through the tunnel, followed by soft whistles that bounced off the dirt walls. They were coming after us, but not quickly, almost confidently, like they knew the tunnel better than we did. We reached a split in the passage. One path led deeper underground. The other sloped upward toward a faint light. I chose the light. As we climbed, the sound of whistles changed behind us. They stopped chasing. Instead, they started waiting. And from far below, I heard something massive moving through the tunnels. Something much larger than the crawling ones. Something that made even them fall completely silent. The upward tunnel finally broke through into a collapsed shed about 50 yards behind the cabin. Cold night air hit us like a shock, and for a moment I thought we had escaped. The boy collapsed onto the ground, shaking violently, while I scanned the forest for any movement. The woods were too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Unnatural quiet. Even the wind had stopped. From the direction of the cabin, I could still hear faint whistles, but they were different now. Slower. Almost patient. Like they were no longer hunting, but simply marking time until they decided to continue. Then I saw Deputy Weaver. He was stumbling out of the cabin's front door, barely alive, dragging his revolver in one hand. His uniform was torn apart, and deep scratches covered his face and neck. He looked toward us for a second, as if trying to say something. But before he could speak, something grabbed him from behind. Not fast, not violent, just inevitable. A pale arm slowly pulled him backward into the darkness of the doorway. Weaver didn't even scream. He just looked at me with wide, helpless eyes as he disappeared inside. The cabin door shut on its own, and all the whistles stopped again. The silence that followed felt like a warning, because now they knew exactly where we were outside too. We ran. The boy and I pushed through the forest blindly, not caring about direction anymore. Every shadow looked like a person. Every branch sounded like footsteps. The mountain felt alive around us, as if the entire forest was watching our escape. We eventually reached the dirt road where I had parked my car hours earlier. It felt unreal seeing it again, a normal object in a place that no longer felt normal. I turned back one last time toward Black Pine Mountain, and that was when I saw them. Dozens of figures stood at the tree line, completely still, watching us from the darkness. Some were tall and adult-shaped. Others were smaller, barely visible between the trees. And somewhere deeper in the forest, I could see something much larger moving slowly behind them. The same presence from before, the one that made even them stop hunting. None of them followed us. They didn't need to. As I started my car and drove away, the boy sitting in the passenger seat whispered something I will never forget. They only let some families leave, so others can replace them. Months later, I tried to report everything officially, but the cabin was gone when authorities returned. No tunnel, no bodies, no signs of disturbance, just an empty mountain. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint scratching sounds under my own house. And sometimes, I swear I hear a whistle answering from far away in the hills. My name is Jason Caldwell, and this happened in the summer of 2020 while I was working as a volunteer search and rescue trainee in rural Tennessee. Most of our calls were simple: lost hikers, stranded vehicles, the usual mountain emergencies. But one case still stands out as something none of us were prepared for. It started with a missing couple who had gone camping near an unmarked section of the Cherokee National Forest. Their last GPS signal placed them near a stretch of land that wasn't on any official map. Locals called it Dead Hollow Ridge, a place people avoided because old logging roads there were supposed to have collapsed years ago. The couple's car was found abandoned at the edge of the forest. Doors open, bags still inside. No signs of struggle, just gone. I joined the search team 2 days later when the operation expanded. There were 6 of us in total, including an experienced ranger named Officer Mallory Briggs, who kept insisting we shouldn't go deeper than the old service trail. "There's a reason that area isn't on maps," she said. "Some things don't want to be found." At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic. That changed when we found the road that wasn't supposed to exist. The road appeared suddenly after nearly 3 hours of hiking. One moment we were pushing through thick forest with no clear direction, and the next, the trees opened into a straight, perfectly flattened dirt path cutting deep into the mountains. It looked ancient, but also maintained in a strange way, as if something still used it regularly. Officer Briggs went completely silent when she saw it. "No," she muttered. "That shouldn't be here." The road stretched forward between 2 steep cliffs covered in moss and dead vines. No tire tracks, no wildlife, not even insects. The air itself felt heavier the closer we got. We followed it anyway. After another mile, we found something even more impossible: a bridge. It spanned across a deep gorge hidden between the cliffs, but it wasn't made of steel or modern materials. It was built from old wood and stone, reinforced with what looked like animal bones tied into the structure with thick rope. And yet, it was intact. Not just intact, fresh, as if it had been repaired recently. The strangest part was the carvings along its sides, symbols etched into the wood that looked almost like warnings rather than decoration. Officer Briggs refused to step any closer. "We don't cross it," she said firmly. "We mark it, and we leave." But before anyone could respond, we heard something on the other side of the bridge. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming toward us from the opposite end. We all heard it clearly this time. Footsteps. Not rushing, not stumbling, just slow, steady steps echoing across the wooden bridge from the fog on the other side. Everyone in our search team instinctively stepped back, except Officer Briggs, who raised her flashlight and aimed it straight down the length of the structure. The beam cut through the mist, revealing only empty planks. For a moment, I thought maybe it was wildlife, or the wind shifting the old wood. Then the footsteps stopped, right in the middle of the bridge, and something spoke, not loudly, not clearly, but enough that we all froze. It sounded like a man trying to imitate speech after not using his voice for years. The sound carried strangely across the gorge, almost like it was coming from inside the bridge itself rather than above it. Officer Briggs slowly lowered her flashlight and whispered, "Nobody answer it." One of the trainees behind me nervously asked what it was, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the carvings along the bridge railing now, as if she recognized them. That was when I noticed something else. Fresh footprints were appearing in the damp wood right in front of us, forming one by one, as if someone invisible was walking toward us from the other side, but nothing was there. Officer Briggs suddenly ordered us to retreat. Her voice was sharp, urgent, and unlike anything she had used before. She didn't explain why. She just kept repeating that we needed to leave the road immediately. But before we could move, the footsteps started again. Only this time, they weren't on the bridge. They were behind us. All 6 of us turned at the same time. The forest path we had come from was empty, at least at first glance. Then one of the trainees shouted and pointed toward the trees. Something was standing there, a figure, tall, thin, and barely visible through the fog. It didn't move like a normal person. Its posture was too stiff, too unnatural, like it was learning how to stand by watching humans. The head tilted slightly as if studying us. Then it stepped forward, and another figure appeared behind it, and another. Officer Briggs raised her rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the gorge, but the figures didn't react the way anything living should have. Instead, they slowly backed away, not fleeing, just disappearing into the fog like they were dissolving into it. That's when the bridge behind us creaked loudly. We turned back instantly and saw something horrifying. The footprints were now coming toward us again, faster this time, like whatever had been on the bridge was no longer stopping. It was crossing, and it was almost here. Panic hit the group all at once. One of the trainees shouted that we should fall back into the forest, but Officer Briggs snapped at him to stay quiet. Her voice had changed completely now, less like a leader, more like someone trying not to attract attention from something already too close. The footprints on the bridge were no longer slow. They were moving fast, but still nothing was visible. Then the wood beneath us groaned violently, as if something extremely heavy had just stepped onto the bridge's center. A deep cracking sound followed, and a few of the bone reinforcements snapped loose and dropped into the gorge below. We all started backing away instinctively. That's when I finally saw it. Not fully, just partially. A distortion in the fog, like the shape of a man stretched too tall, too thin, with limbs that didn't bend correctly. It wasn't walking normally. It was gliding across the planks, each step landing without sound, yet the bridge reacted as if something massive was pressing down on it. Officer Briggs whispered something under her breath that I barely caught. "Don't let it hear your fear." But it was too late for that. One of the trainees turned and ran. The second he stepped off the bridge path, the fog behind us shifted violently, like something had noticed the movement. And the running stopped being footsteps. It became pursuit. The moment the trainee ran, everything changed. The forest behind us erupted with movement. Not animals, not wind, but something coordinated. Branches snapped in multiple directions at once, and the fog thickened so quickly it felt like the world itself was closing in. Officer Briggs grabbed my arm and forced me backward toward the trees. "Don't look at it directly," she warned. "It learns faster if you acknowledge it." That made no sense at the time, but I didn't question her. Not after I heard the sound coming from the bridge again. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was dragging. Something heavy was pulling itself across the wood, piece by piece, like it was assembling its own movement as it came closer. We reached the tree line just as the first scream echoed from the forest behind us. It was the trainee who ran. The scream didn't last long. Then there was silence again. Complete, suffocating silence. Officer Briggs ordered us to keep moving downhill without stopping. No lights, no talking, just movement. But as we descended, I started noticing something disturbing. We weren't alone on the path. There were shapes between the trees again. But this time, they weren't standing still. They were walking alongside us, keeping pace, just out of sight. And every few seconds, one of them would whisper something I couldn't understand, always ending in the same word, the name of the bridge. We kept moving downhill for what felt like hours, but the terrain didn't feel natural anymore. The forest seemed to repeat itself in strange ways. Same broken tree, same cluster of rocks, same fallen log appearing again and again, like we were circling inside something that refused to let us leave. Officer Briggs finally stopped us behind a large ridge and ordered everyone to stay completely still. She listened carefully, scanning the darkness with a look I had never seen on her before, fear mixed with recognition. "They're guiding us," she whispered. One of the remaining trainees asked what she meant, but she didn't answer. Instead, she pointed back toward the direction we came from. Between the trees, faint movement was visible again. Not chasing now, but positioning, like they were forming a loose perimeter around us. And then I heard it again. The bridge sound. A deep wooden groan carried through the forest, even though we were miles away from it. It wasn't just sound. It felt like a vibration inside my chest, like something massive had fully crossed, and was now adjusting itself to this side of the gorge. Officer Briggs suddenly grabbed my radio and smashed it against a rock without hesitation. "No signals," she said sharply. "It listens through interference." That's when I realized something terrifying. Every time we stopped, the forest got quieter. But every time we moved, it got closer. We made the worst decision at dawn. Or maybe it wasn't a decision at all. Just exhaustion forcing us forward. The forest finally opened into a wide clearing surrounded by cliffs, and in the center of it stood something none of us expected to see. Another bridge, identical to the first one. Same wood, same bone reinforcements, same impossible carvings along the railings. But this one wasn't in fog. It was perfectly visible under morning light. Officer Briggs went pale the moment she saw it. She whispered something under her breath. I didn't fully understand. Something about return structures and closed crossings. One of the remaining trainees insisted we cross it, saying it might lead back to the real trail. But Briggs raised her weapon and told him firmly that crossing meant completing the loop. Before anyone could react, the wind stopped completely. The forest fell into absolute silence again. And from both directions, the path behind us and the bridge in front of us, we heard footsteps at the same time. Approaching, synchronized, the same slow, deliberate movement we heard before. Only now there were two sources, coming toward us from both sides. And Officer Briggs finally said the words I still can't forget. We were never supposed to find the first bridge, because it wasn't the entrance. It was the exit. The moment Briggs said it, everything changed in how we understood the forest. It wasn't that we were being hunted anymore. It was worse. We were being processed. The footsteps from both sides grew closer in perfect sync, like two separate groups moving in mirror coordination. The air in the clearing felt wrong, compressed, almost like pressure, building inside a sealed container. One of the trainees dropped his backpack and started backing away toward the first bridge without thinking. Briggs shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. The second he stepped onto the edge of the bridge, the carvings along the wood began to darken, as if absorbing moisture or heat from his presence. The bones embedded in the railings made a soft cracking sound, like something waking up. And then we saw him again. Not fully formed, just parts of him appearing in segments. First the legs on the bridge, then the torso, then the head emerging from the fog like it was assembling itself out of distance. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, the second bridge on the opposite side of the clearing began reacting the same way. Something was forming there, too. Briggs grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me down behind a rock formation. "Do not look at both at once," she said urgently. "That's how they sink you." I didn't understand what she meant until I glanced too quickly between the two bridges. For a split second, I felt something inside my mind shift. Like something had noticed I was aware of both paths at the same time. And both entities stopped moving. Everything went silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. The trainee who had stepped onto the bridge froze completely, standing in the middle of the wooden planks like he was suddenly unable to move his body. His head slowly tilted upward, and I could see his lips moving, but no sound came out. Then both bridges began to creak at the same time. The entities on each side started moving again, but now their movement was identical, perfectly mirrored, like reflections in a broken mirror trying to align. Officer Briggs suddenly made a decision I will never forget. She raised her rifle, not at the creatures, but at the bridge supports. Before anyone could stop her, she fired 3 shots into the base of the nearest structure. The effect was immediate. The carvings on both bridges flared darkly, almost like they were reacting in pain. A deep, resonating sound rolled through the clearing, not from the wood, but from somewhere beneath it. Then the impossible happened. The 2 bridges began to move toward each other, not physically sliding, but visually collapsing the space between them, like reality itself was trying to decide which one should exist. The trainee screamed as the planks beneath him bent unnaturally upward, and in a flash of distorted motion, both entities reached toward him at the same time. Briggs shouted for us to run. We didn't hesitate. As we fled the clearing, I looked back one final time. The 2 bridges had become one, and whatever was on them was no longer separate. It was whole, and it was looking at us. Even now, I still don't fully understand what we saw in that forest. But I do know this. Some roads don't lead somewhere. They lead back. My name is Eric Donovan, and this happened in the fall of 2019 when I worked as a maintenance technician for remote communication sites across rural Pennsylvania. Most of my job was boring, climbing towers, replacing antennas, checking signal equipment in areas where no one else wanted to go. But one assignment changed everything. I was sent alone to service an old emergency radio tower deep in the Allegheny backcountry. The site was marked as inactive but structurally maintained, meaning the equipment should have been offline but still physically intact. The drive itself took nearly 5 hours. The last stretch wasn't even a road anymore, just a narrow service trail cutting through dense forest that barely showed up on GPS. My supervisor told me the tower hadn't been checked in over a year, but recently, emergency signal test had picked up strange interference coming from it. At first, they thought it was just faulty wiring, until the signal started repeating words, not static, words. The last technician who visited the site reportedly quit his job the same day without explanation and refused to talk about what he saw. When I asked my supervisor about it, he just said, "Fix the equipment. Don't stay longer than you need to." That was the first time I ever heard him sound uneasy. The radio tower stood at the top of a steep ridge surrounded by thick pine forest. It was much older than I expected. Rusted metal beams, peeling paint, and warning signs faded almost completely white from years of weather exposure. The air around it felt strangely heavy. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. I climbed the fenced perimeter and made my way toward the control shack at the base of the tower. The lock on the door was broken, hanging loosely as if someone had forced it open recently. Inside, everything looked intact at first glance. Old monitors, dusty control panels, stacked equipment logs. But something immediately felt wrong. The emergency radio inside was turned on, and it was receiving a signal. I checked the frequency display. It wasn't broadcasting from outside. It was looping from within the tower itself. Then I heard it. A voice, low, distorted, and repeating the same phrase over and over again. "Still here. Still listening." I froze immediately, realizing the transmission wasn't coming from the outside world. It was coming from somewhere inside the tower, above me. I tried to convince myself it was just interference, or a looping recording left behind by the previous technician, but the longer I stood inside that shack, the more personal the voice sounded. It wasn't random static anymore. There were pauses between the words, like whoever was speaking was aware of timing, aware of being heard. I checked the logbook on the desk, hoping for some explanation. The last entry was dated over 14 months ago. It simply read, "Signal becomes clearer at night. Do not answer it." That's when the radio suddenly changed frequency on its own. The speaker crackled once, then went completely silent for about 10 seconds. I remember thinking it had finally stopped, but then a new voice came through, softer than before, almost calm. "Eric, you finally came." I dropped the logbook instantly. No one was supposed to know my name. I spun around toward the doorway, expecting someone outside the shack, but the forest was still empty. The silence outside felt heavier now, like it was pressing against the walls. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice sounded closer, as if it was speaking directly beside my ear. "You're late." I ran outside immediately, scanning the base of the tower and the surrounding forest, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement. Just the tall metal structure stretching upward into the foggy sky like a skeletal spine. Still, the voice continued through the radio I had accidentally carried outside with me. "Don't climb yet," it said calmly. "You always climb too fast." That stopped me completely. The speaker wasn't just broadcasting anymore. It was reacting to what I was doing in real time. I looked up at the tower. Halfway up, maybe 30 meters above the ground, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small maintenance platform that should have been empty, but wasn't. Something moved there. At first, I thought it was just shifting cables or wind interference, but then I realized the shape was wrong. Too still. too deliberate. It was sitting on the platform watching me. Then the radio inside the shack spoke again. He doesn't like visitors during daylight. The figure on the tower slowly leaned forward, and I finally understood what I was looking at. It wasn't equipment. It was a person. Someone had been living inside the radio tower, and they were still there. I stepped back toward the shack instinctively, but the radio I was holding started heating up in my hands. Not warm like electronics under load, hot like something was forcing energy through it from the inside. The voice on the speaker didn't sound distant anymore. It sounded focused, as if it was watching my exact movements through my own thoughts. "You can leave the ground if you want," it said softly, "but you already heard me. That means you belong to the signal now." I tried switching the device off, but the power button didn't respond. The frequency dial spun on its own, clicking through channels faster than I could follow. Every channel produced the same voice, layered differently, like multiple versions of the same person speaking from different distances. From above, the man on the tower shifted again. This time I saw his face. It was pale and sunburned at the same time, like he had lived under harsh light for too long without ever leaving the structure. His eyes were fixed on me, but there was something wrong with his focus. Like he wasn't just looking at me physically, but through me, as if reading what I would do next. Then the radio whispered something that made my stomach drop. He climbed too fast, too. The ladder at the base of the tower suddenly creaked. I hadn't even touched it. Step by step, something invisible began climbing down. The metal rungs vibrated under weight that wasn't visible, bending slightly with each movement. I backed away toward the shack again, but the radio in my hand started playing a different sound now. Not speech, but breathing. Slow, controlled breathing, as if someone was standing right behind me, matching my rhythm. Then the voice returned, but this time it was no longer calm. It sounded closer to frustration. "He's trying to unplug me again." I froze. From above, the man on the tower suddenly slammed his hand against the metal railing. The sound echoed through the forest, like a gunshot. Birds that weren't there scattered from nearby trees. Even though I couldn't hear them before, I suddenly realized the entire forest had been holding its breath. The ladder stopped moving. Whatever was climbing, it paused. And then, from inside the shack, every monitor screen flickered on at the same time, even though I never powered them up. On every screen, the same message appeared. Signal stabilized. And below it, "Do not descend the tower." The warning on the screens didn't fade. It just stayed there, pulsing slightly, like the system itself was breathing. I backed out of the shack slowly, my eyes locked on the monitors, afraid that looking away even for a second would change something irreversible. From above, the man on the tower finally moved again. But this time he didn't just watch. He spoke without the radio. His voice carried naturally through the air, breaking the silence of the forest. "You shouldn't have brought a handheld device near the base." The radio in my hand suddenly went dead silent. No breathing, no static, just nothing. That silence was somehow worse than the voice. Then I heard footsteps inside the shack behind me. Slow, deliberate, coming from the inside, even though I was certain I had been alone when I stepped out. I turned slightly without fully committing, and through the cracked doorway I saw movement between the equipment racks. Not fast, not aggressive, just patient. Like whatever was inside had been there long before I arrived and was simply waiting for me to notice it. The man on the tower spoke again, quieter now. "He only comes down when the signal's disturbed." I looked up at him, confused, and that's when I realized something terrifying. He wasn't warning me. He was warning whatever was inside the shack. The shack door slowly closed on its own, not slammed, not pushed, just gently pulled shut, like something inside had finished observing me and decided I was no longer the focus. The monitors inside flickered one last time before going dark, but the message remained burned into my mind. "Do not descend the tower." Above, the man on the radio tower finally stood up fully for the first time. Until that moment, I thought he was just trapped or surviving up there. But when he straightened, I realized the truth. He wasn't trapped. He was maintaining something. His movements were precise, controlled, like someone performing a task he had repeated for a very long time. He looked down at the forest, then slowly pointed toward the shack. And then I understood what signal stabilized really meant. It wasn't a warning. It was an update. Something inside the system had fully recognized me. The forest lights around the tower, small indicator lamps I hadn't noticed before, suddenly began turning on one by one, spreading outward into the trees like a network activating. The radio, now silent in my hand, suddenly turned itself back on one final time. And in a voice that didn't belong to the man on the tower anymore, it said, "Replacement required." After the words, "replacement required," everything went completely still. Even the wind stopped moving through the trees, like the entire forest had paused to listen for what would happen next. I tried to step backward, but my feet felt heavy, as if the ground itself had started resisting movement. The radio in my hand began to vibrate again, not with sound this time, but with a deep physical pulse that matched my heartbeat. From the tower above, the man slowly descended one step, then another. But he wasn't climbing down the ladder anymore. He was lowering himself without touching it. Like gravity didn't fully apply to him. The forest lights continued to glow, spreading further outward in a widening circle. And with each light that turned on, I felt something inside my thoughts shifting. Small memories becoming unclear, like someone was rearranging my sense of direction. The shack door behind me opened again. This time, I didn't see movement inside. I saw light. Not normal light, but the same eerie glow coming from the forest lamps, now filling the interior of the shack completely. And in that glow, I realized the equipment racks were no longer just equipment. They were arranged like a control system, a system I was standing inside of, and I finally understood why the last technician disappeared. He hadn't left. He had been integrated. The man reached the ground without ever fully climbing down. He stood a few feet in front of me, calm and expressionless, as if he had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. His skin looked stretched tighter now, his eyes reflecting the same flickering light coming from the forest. He didn't attack. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply held out his hand. Behind him, the radio tower emitted a low humming sound that I could feel in my chest more than hear. The entire structure seemed alive now, like it was confirming completion of something I couldn't comprehend. The radio in my hand spoke one last time, but the voice had changed completely. It sounded like mine. "You don't fix the tower," it said softly. "You become part of it." The man stepped closer, and I felt something inside my mind begin to disconnect. Not painfully, but smoothly, like being gently unplugged from who I thought I was. The last thing I remember clearly is looking up at the tower and seeing my own reflection standing on the platform above, wearing my clothes, looking down at me. And then everything went silent. They found my truck 2 days later at the site. But I was never inside it, and according to the system logs, a new technician was already registered at the tower before anyone even arrived. Eric Donovan, active. My name is Oliver Hayes, and this happened in the spring of 2021 while I was working as a traveling insurance investigator. My job was simple on paper: verify claims, inspect damaged properties, and document cases in rural areas where records were often incomplete. I had been sent to investigate a property damage claim in a small Appalachian town called Millhaven Hollow, located somewhere along the Kentucky-West Virginia border. The strange part was that I couldn't find much about it before the trip. Online maps showed inconsistent locations and older records listed it under different county names depending on the year. When I called the claimant, a man who identified himself as Pastor Ellery Graves, he sounded unusually calm. He insisted that the town was real, but warned me not to arrive after sunset. "After dark," he said, "the town decides what it wants to show you." I assumed it was just small-town superstition. Still, I planned my arrival for early afternoon, But as I drove deeper into the mountains, my GPS began behaving strangely, rerouting me onto roads that weren't listed anywhere on official maps. Every time I tried to correct it manually, the system would override my input and guide me back toward a single destination, Millhaven Hollow. Even though, according to every map I checked, I should have already passed it. The road finally opened into what looked like a valley surrounded by steep forested hills. At the entrance stood a weathered wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Millhaven Hollow," though the paint was so faded it looked almost rewritten multiple times. But something immediately felt off. There were no cars, no movement, no sounds of daily life, just perfectly arranged houses along a narrow main street, all of them facing inward toward the center square, like they had been positioned deliberately rather than naturally built. I parked near what looked like the town hall and stepped out. The air was still in a way that felt unnatural. No wind, no insects, no birds. Even my footsteps sounded too loud against the empty streets. That's when I noticed something disturbing. Every window in every building was slightly open, not fully, just cracked, as if the entire town was watching me arrive. Then I saw a group of people standing at the far end of the street. They weren't moving. They were waiting. And every single one of them was looking directly at me. I remember convincing myself that they were just locals, standing still out of curiosity, maybe waiting for some kind of visitor announcement or town routine I didn't understand yet. But the longer I stood there, in the middle of Millhaven Hollow's main street, the more unnatural their stillness became. They didn't blink. They didn't shift weight. Even from a distance, I could see their eyes were locked on me with the same level of focus, like I was the only moving object in a world that had paused. Then one of them finally stepped forward, a woman in a faded gray dress, carrying what looked like a folded ledger. She walked slowly, not cautiously, just deliberately, as if she already knew exactly how far she needed to come before speaking. When she reached me, she stopped at what felt like an exact measured distance. Not too close, not too far. "You arrived before adjustment," she said calmly. I asked what she meant by adjustment, but she didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and looked past me, toward the road I had driven in on. For a moment, I turned instinctively. But the road behind me wasn't there anymore. There was just forest. Solid, unbroken forest. I turned back immediately, thinking I had simply missed a bend in the road or parked further inside the town than I remembered. But when I looked again, the entire layout of Millhaven Hollow felt subtly different, like the geometry of the streets had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. The woman was still standing in front of me, but now the other townspeople had moved slightly closer as well. Not walking, not rushing, just repositioning themselves between blinks, closing the distance in ways I couldn't track. I asked where Pastor Ellery Graves was, and that question seemed to change something in the atmosphere. A few of them exchanged brief glances. Not confusion, permission. The woman finally opened her ledger and flipped through several pages before stopping on one. She didn't look at it for long, just long enough to confirm something. "Pastor Graves is currently holding continuity position," she said. That phrase didn't make any sense, but before I could ask anything else, a church bell rang, somewhere deeper in the town. It was a single tone, slow and heavy, echoing through the valley like a signal rather than a call. Every person on the street turned their head in perfect unison toward the sound, and for the first time, I noticed something carved into the buildings themselves, markings. The same pattern repeated across doors, windows, and walls, as if the entire town wasn't built. It was recorded. The church bell didn't ring again, but the silence it left behind felt even louder, like the entire valley was holding its breath in expectation of something that was already scheduled. The townspeople began moving again, but not in a chaotic way. Their movements were slow, coordinated, and strangely purposeful, as if each person had been assigned a specific role the moment I arrived. The woman with the ledger closed it and gestured for me to follow. I hesitated, but two of the men from the street were already positioned behind me, not blocking me exactly, but making it clear that leaving wasn't part of the current options available. I didn't see them move into those positions. They were just suddenly there when I looked back. We walked toward the center of the town where a narrow stone path led uphill toward a church I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It was just easy to overlook, like your mind actively avoided registering it until it became relevant. The church itself looked older than the rest of the town. The wood was darker, almost black in places, and the windows reflected no light at all, even though the sun was still up. Carvings, identical to the ones on the town buildings, covered its doors, but here they were deeper, more deliberate, like they had been reinforced over time. The woman stopped at the entrance and finally spoke again without looking at me. "You are not the first to arrive early," she said, "but you're the first to notice." Before I could ask what I was supposed to notice, the doors of the church slowly opened on their own, and something inside shifted. Not a sound. A presence. Inside the church, there were no pews arranged in the usual way. Instead, the seating formed a circular pattern facing inward, as if the entire room was designed for observation rather than worship. At the center stood a tall wooden lectern, and behind it a large hanging structure made of layered wooden frames and metal rods, shaped almost like a distorted map of the town itself. Pastor Ellery Graves was already there. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he looked like he had been waiting for a specific timing rather than a specific person. He was older than I expected, with calm eyes that carried an unsettling awareness, like someone who had repeated the same conversation many times before and already knew every possible response. "You arrived before the final alignment," he said gently, almost disappointed rather than alarmed. I asked him what alignment meant, and he finally stepped away from the lectern and gestured toward the structure behind him. "That is Millhaven Hollow," he said. "Not the town, the record of it." I looked closer at the hanging structure and realized it wasn't just symbolic. It was layered with miniature versions of streets, buildings, and pathways, exact replicas suspended in a controlled arrangement. Some sections looked complete. Others were still shifting slightly, as if being actively edited. The pastor noticed my confusion and continued. "This place does not stay in one state for long," he said. "It adjusts itself based on who observes it." Then he looked directly at me for the first time with something sharper in his expression. "And you are observing incorrectly." At that exact moment, every carved symbol in the church walls darkened at the same time, like something had just acknowledged his statement. After the carvings darkened, the church felt different immediately, like the air itself had tightened. It wasn't louder or darker in a physical sense, but the sense of space changed, as if the room had become aware of how I was interpreting it. Pastor Ellery Graves didn't react in panic. Instead, he looked almost resigned, like this was a predictable correction rather than a crisis. The townspeople who had followed me inside were now standing along the walls of the church in perfect stillness, facing inward toward the model of Millhaven Hollow. I asked him what was happening, but he raised one hand slightly, signaling for silence. "The adjustment has begun," he said calmly. "You should not interrupt it." That was when I noticed the model hanging above the lectern was changing. Not subtly. Actively. Entire sections of the miniature town were shifting position, as if invisible hands were rearranging streets and buildings in real time. Some structures collapsed inward and reformed elsewhere, roads straightened. Others bent into loops, and with every change, faint echoes of movement outside the church followed the same pattern. It took me a moment to realize what that meant. The real town was mirroring the model. I rushed toward the church doors, but when I pushed them open, I didn't see the street I had entered through earlier. I saw a completely different layout. Buildings were in new positions. The street was narrower. The sky looked the same, but the sense of direction was gone. Millhaven Hollow had changed while I was inside, and it was still changing. I stepped back inside the church instinctively, and the doors closed behind me without force. No slam, no sound of impact, just a quiet ceiling, like the building had decided the conversation was still ongoing. Pastor Graves walked closer to the hanging model and gently placed his hand beneath it, steadying one of the shifting sections as if he was guiding its transformation rather than resisting it. "You are witnessing the correction layer," he said. "This happens whenever the town is observed by someone outside its record." I asked him what would happen if the correction finished. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me with an expression that was almost pity. "Then Millhaven Hollow becomes stable again," he said, "and you will no longer remember it correctly." The words didn't make sense at first, but something about the way he said correctly made my thoughts feel uncertain, like my memory itself was being questioned. Behind him, the townspeople began whispering in unison, though their lips barely moved. Not words I could understand, just a synchronized hum of agreement that grew louder as the model above continued to reconfigure itself. Then I saw something that made my chest tighten. A small miniature version of myself appeared in the model, standing at the church entrance, looking inside, exactly where I was. Pastor Graves noticed my reaction and nodded slightly, as if confirming something inevitable. "You were always part of the layout," he said softly. "We just hadn't placed you yet." The moment I saw the miniature version of myself inside the hanging model, something inside my perception started to fracture. It wasn't physical pain. It was more like the certainty of where I was standing began to lose its anchor. The church, the townspeople, even Pastor Graves started feeling less solid, as if they were being interpreted rather than experienced. The model above the lectern stabilized for the first time since I had entered. Streets stopped shifting, buildings locked into place, and my miniature self inside it began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing clarity, it turned its head upward, not toward the church ceiling, toward me. Pastor Graves stepped aside from the lectern and spoke more quietly now, almost like he was concluding something rather than warning me. "When observation stabilizes," he said, "the observer must be integrated into the record." The townspeople along the walls began stepping forward in unison, not rushing, not attacking, just closing the space between us with calm inevitability. Their expressions remained unchanged, but their presence felt heavier now, like they were no longer individuals, but parts of a single system executing completion. I turned back toward the church doors again, but when I reached them this time, there was no resistance. They were already open. Outside, Millhaven Hollow was perfectly still, but it wasn't the same town anymore. It matched the model exactly, down to every detail, and at the center of the street, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A miniature version of the church itself had appeared outside, waiting. I don't remember deciding to step forward, but I remember the moment my foot crossed the threshold of the church. Everything outside and inside aligned instantly, like two versions of the same structure finally agreeing on a single state. The townspeople stopped moving. The model above the lectern stopped shifting. Even Pastor Graves stood perfectly still, watching as if the final condition had been met. My vision narrowed, not into darkness, but into structure. I could see Millhaven Hollow from above and below at the same time. The streets, the buildings, the church, all layered together like a living diagram. And in the center of it, I was no longer a visitor. I was a node, a fixed point in a system that no longer required observation to function. Pastor Graves spoke one last time, his voice now blending into the space itself rather than coming from a single direction. "Thank you for confirming continuity." Then the sensation stopped, not abruptly, just evenly, like something had settled into its correct configuration. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing on an empty road in the mountains. No town, no church, no people, just trees and silence. But in my hand was a folded paper map I don't remember receiving. and on it one location was permanently marked, Millhaven Hollow, with a note written beneath it, active when observed. Sometimes, when I pass through that region again, my GPS briefly shows a road that shouldn't exist, but I never stop anymore, because I've learned something important. Some places don't disappear. They just wait for someone to look again. My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened in late 2023 when I moved into an old rental property outside rural North Carolina. I had taken the place because it was cheap, isolated, and honestly perfect for the kind of quiet life I wanted after a long, stressful job change. The house itself sat at the edge of a pine forest, far from any neighbors. The listing described it as recently renovated, but when I arrived, it already felt older than anything I had ever lived in. The wood on the porch creaked even when nothing was moving, and the air around the house felt strangely humid, like it was holding heat inside its walls. The landlord, a quiet man who barely introduced himself, gave me the keys and left within minutes. Before he drove away, he said something that didn't make sense at the time. "Don't worry if the house sounds alive at night," he said. "It always does that when it settles." I laughed it off, assuming he meant old pipes or wind through the structure. That first night I realized he didn't mean pipes. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, deep, and coming from inside the walls. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling, maybe wind slipping through old insulation or pipes reacting to temperature changes. But the sound didn't behave like any natural noise I had ever heard. It was rhythmic, almost intentional, like something was resting inside the structure and adjusting its breathing to the silence of the night. I got out of bed and walked through the hallway, turning on lights as I went. The house felt normal visually. No movement, no visible damage. But the sound grew clearer the deeper I went inside. It wasn't localized to one room. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. When I reached the kitchen, I noticed something odd. The cabinets were slightly open, even though I remembered closing them before sleeping. Not wide open, just cracked, like small gaps had been created deliberately for airflow. Then I noticed the floorboards beneath me. They shifted slightly when I stood still, not creaking, moving, as if something beneath the house had adjusted its position in response to my presence. That's when I realized the breathing wasn't inside the walls at all. It was coming from underneath the house, and it was getting closer. I stepped back from the kitchen slowly, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Old houses do strange things at night, settling wood, shifting temperature, airflow through vents. That's what I kept repeating in my head while I moved toward the hallway, forcing myself to stay calm. But the breathing didn't stop. It followed me, not like sound traveling through space, but like the house itself was directing it toward wherever I stood. When I paused in the hallway, it paused. When I moved, it resumed. That's when I realized something worse. The rhythm wasn't random anymore. It was matching me. I turned off the hallway lights one by one, hoping darkness would make it easier to rationalize. But instead, it made the sound clearer. Each breath felt heavier, closer, like the house was learning my timing through absence of light. Then I noticed the wall beside me. A faint bulge formed in the plaster for just a second before flattening again like something had pressed against it from the inside and then released. I froze completely, watching the same spot. It happened again. Not random movement, not settling. A deliberate press, like a hand testing the boundary between inside and outside. And from somewhere below the floorboards, I heard something new layered into the breathing. A sound that almost resembled my own voice exhaling. I backed into the living room without taking my eyes off the hallway wall. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave the house immediately, but something about the sound made that idea feel pointless, like leaving wasn't actually an option anymore. The breathing grew louder when I entered the living room, as if the house approved of that direction. The floorboards here felt different too, softer in places, slightly uneven, like sections had been replaced without proper support beneath them. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Not even a weak connection, just an empty indicator as if the outside world had been cut off completely. Then the lights flickered once, just once, but in that single flicker, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. For a fraction of a second, the walls weren't walls anymore. They were skin, not human skin exactly, but something layered and stretched, holding the structure together like a living membrane. And beneath it, slow movement, expanding and contracting in sync with the breathing sound. When the lights stabilized again, I stepped backward in shock, knocking over a small table behind me. The sound echoed too loudly, too sharply, and immediately, everything inside the house went still. The breathing stopped. Complete silence followed, for about 5 seconds. Then every single surface in the house inhaled at once. The synchronized inhale hit like a physical force. It wasn't just sound anymore. The entire house seemed to contract inward at the same time, as if every wall, floorboard, and ceiling beam had tightened around a single, shared lung. I stumbled backward and fell against the couch, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear anything else. Then came the exhale, slow, deep, controlled, and with it, the house relaxed again, like it had just acknowledged my presence. I stayed frozen for a moment, trying to understand what I had just experienced. But the pattern was now undeniable. The house wasn't reacting randomly. It was responding to awareness itself, like it was becoming more active the more I noticed it. I forced myself to move toward the front door, but every step felt heavier than the last. The air inside the house seemed denser now, almost resistant, like walking through water that didn't want me to leave. Halfway to the door, I heard a soft sound behind me. A creak. Slow and deliberate. Not from the floor this time, from the ceiling. I looked up instinctively and saw a faint ripple moving across the ceiling boards above me, as if something large had shifted its position directly overhead. And then I realized something worse. The breathing wasn't coming from below anymore. It was all around me now. I stopped moving completely, standing in the middle of the living room, trying to focus on anything that still felt normal. The furniture, the walls, the locked front door. Anything that could convince my brain that this was just fear exaggerating ordinary house sounds. But the house didn't give me time to rationalize anymore. The breathing changed again. This time, it slowed. Not calming down, focusing. Like something inside the structure had noticed that I was no longer moving. And then, from every direction at once, I heard a soft, deliberate sound that didn't belong to the breathing cycle. Footsteps. Not heavy ones. Not rushing. Careful ones. Walking inside the walls. I turned toward the hallway, and this time I saw something clearly that I had only noticed in fragments before. The walls weren't just shifting anymore. They were subtly deforming in places, forming shallow outlines that resembled movement patterns, like something was pacing inside the structure itself, matching the layout of the house. Then the hallway light turned on by itself, and at the far end, I saw a shadow standing perfectly still. But when I blinked, it wasn't at the end of the hallway anymore. It was one room closer, and the house exhaled again. I didn't run at first. I couldn't. My body was reacting slower than my mind, like the house was interfering with the connection between thought and movement. The shadow in the hallway didn't move again immediately, and that made it worse, because stillness in that house never meant absence. It meant preparation. The breathing resumed, but now it was uneven, slightly deeper on one side of the house than the other, like multiple lungs were operating in different rooms. I realized then that what I had been calling the house might not be a single thing. It might be layers of something far more complex, all stacked together in the shape of a home. The hallway shadow shifted again, but this time I noticed something worse than its movement. It wasn't alone. A second shape formed behind it, partially overlapping the first, as if more than one presence was occupying the same narrow space. They weren't stepping forward. They were unfolding into visibility, like the house was deciding how much of them I was allowed to perceive at once. I backed toward the living room again, but the front door clicked softly behind me. Not locked. Just sealed. Like the house had decided the outside was no longer relevant. From beneath the floorboards, a new sound emerged. Not breathing, not footsteps. A slow dragging motion, as if something massive was repositioning itself directly under where I was standing. And then the floor beneath my feet gave a single, deep pulse, like a heartbeat. The heartbeat beneath the floor repeated again, stronger this time, and the entire house responded to it. Every wall seemed to tighten slightly, every corner shifting inward by an almost imperceptible amount, like the structure was syncing itself with whatever was below. I realized I couldn't stay in one place anymore. I moved back toward the kitchen, but the moment I entered, I saw something new that hadn't been there before. The cabinets were fully open now, not just cracked. And inside them, instead of shelves, there was only darkness. Deep, unnatural darkness that didn't reflect light properly. The breathing returned, but it wasn't random anymore. It was layered with movement again, like multiple systems restarting at different intervals. Then I saw the shadow from the hallway again, now standing at the entrance to the kitchen, closer, more defined, and it spoke, not through words, but through the structure of the house itself. The cabinets vibrated softly, forming a sound that almost resembled a sentence, though I couldn't understand the language. Still, my mind interpreted it anyway. You stayed awake. The floor beneath me pulsed again, stronger than before, and I understood something I wish I hadn't. The house wasn't trying to scare me. It was waiting for me to sleep. After the cabinets vibrated with that impossible message, something inside me shifted from fear into pure survival instinct. I stopped trying to understand the house and started focusing only on escape. But every direction I turned, the structure seemed to anticipate me, like it was adjusting its internal pathways to keep me contained. The breathing slowed again, deeper this time, almost satisfied. Not because it had won, but because it sensed I was exhausting myself. The shadow at the kitchen entrance didn't advance anymore. It didn't need to. It had already shaped the space around me into something smaller, tighter, more predictable. I ran back toward the living room, and that's when I saw it. The floorboards were no longer just uneven. They were subtly rising and falling in sections, like the entire house had turned into a single massive chest. Each room expanded and contracted at different moments, creating a staggered rhythm that made my balance feel unstable, like I was moving across something alive and unsteady. Then, from beneath the floor, directly in front of me, a section of wood lifted slightly. Not breaking, not cracking, just rising, like a breath being held too long. And from that small gap, I saw something beneath the house. Not darkness. An eye, open, unblinking, watching upward. I don't remember deciding to run for the bedroom, but that's where my body moved on its own. The house reacted immediately. The breathing pattern changed from slow and controlled to something sharper, more alert, like a system realizing I was attempting to isolate myself. Every hallway felt shorter now. Every doorway felt closer than before. It wasn't just manipulation of space. It felt like compression, like the house was reducing itself around me to make movement predictable and unavoidable. I reached the bedroom and slammed the door shut behind me, but there was no lock. It didn't matter anyway. The moment I turned around, I realized the room itself was already different, smaller than I remembered. Walls slightly curved inward, almost gently enclosing me instead of trapping me violently. The breathing outside stopped, complete silence. Then, from every wall at once came a slow, synchronized inhale. The bedroom lights flickered once, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw the final truth clearly. There was no separation between walls, floor, and ceiling anymore. They were all part of one continuous body, and I was inside it. The lights came back on, and the house exhaled one last time. But this time, it didn't release air. It released calm. The kind that comes right before sleep takes over. I woke up the next morning still inside the house. Everything looked normal again, almost peaceful. But when I looked in the mirror, I noticed something small. My reflection was breathing, a fraction too slowly, and sometimes, late at night now, when I try to sleep anywhere else, I still hear it underneath me, waiting for me to stop moving.